Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and if you couldn't tell from that opening music, we are doing something a little different today. July 4th is coming up, listeners, the date on which we here in the United States celebrate the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which kicked off the Revolutionary War, or the American War of Independence, as I believe it is known in some circles. And I figured, cheeky American that I am, what better opportunity to discuss the Americans in Agatha Christie? Because there are a lot of them, and I knew this before I prepared for this episode, but I don't think I realized to what extent there are a ton of Americans littering the Christie canon. So that is going to be the topic of our episode. But first, I just want to get spoilers out of the way. This is going to be another spoiler-heavy episode, and the plots to the following titles will be discussed / spoiled in ways ranging from extremely tangential and minor to thorough and major. So here goes. The Actress, After the Funeral, The Big Four, A Caribbean Mystery, Cat Among the Pigeons, Death on the Nile, Destination Unknown, Endless Night, Evil Under the Sun, Lord Edgware Dies, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, Motive versus Opportunity, The Mousetrap, though once again only in a minor, tangential way, Mrs. McGinty's Dead, A Murder is Announced, Murder on the Orient Express, The Soul of the Croupier, Sparkling Cyanide, and finally, They Do It with Mirrors. If you are worried about any of those titles being spoiled, you may want to read them before proceeding further with this episode. You have been forewarned, and let's move on now to a little housekeeping. I've got a bulging mailbag here from you listeners. I have a bunch of stuff to get through. I'm going to start with my most recent episode and work my way backward, as I always do. And I got a lot of comments concerning my All About the Gays of Agatha Christie episode, as I knew I would. So here's the first one, and I'm starting with this one because it involves some serious egg on my face here. Here goes. I'm currently listening to your episode about gay and lesbian characters, and I'm a bit surprised that you didn't mention the Mousetrap's Miss Casewell. She's described as a mannish woman in a similar way to Miss Hinchcliffe. At one point, Giles even suggests that she isn't a woman. She also writes a letter to Dearest Jessie, and once the inspector asks her about this, she more or less directly tells him that this is none of his business. Also, and most importantly, one could easily argue that she's the real hero of the play, as it is she who saves another character from the villain in the story's climax. Honestly, I think she should at least be second-ranked only after Hinchcliffe and Murgatroyd. Winky smiley face. Also, as a very minor point, the last Hastings narrated novel pre-curtain was Dumb Witness, because I had said in passing that I believed it was Lord Edgware Dies, so just mistakes made all over the place in that last episode. I actually remembered Miss Casewell about an hour after I published this episode. Much to my chagrin, how could I have forgotten Miss Casewell when I remembered Christopher Wren from The Mousetrap? Because it is absolutely true. Christopher Wren is our coded male homosexual, but Miss Casewell is not even really a coded female homosexual. She is pretty much outright stated to be a lesbian without using the word in this play. It is very clear that she is writing a romantic letter to this other woman. Her appearance, as this listener noted, is quote unquote mannish. And I also agree with this listener that if I had remembered Miss Casewell when I was doing my rundown, I would have put her in the number 2 slot right after Christopher Wren and just before the Mrs. Hinchcliffe and Murgatroyd. And I think that is quite telling. I made this point on the episode about how Christie's portrayal of Hinchcliffe and Murgatroyd is just so much more sympathetic and less threatened than I think some of the portrayals of the male gay characters in the canon. And I was saying how that seems to be a bit of a tradition handed down through the years, perhaps due to the prevalence of the heterosexual male gaze, which tends to find male homosexuals threatening and female homosexuals potentially titillating, or at least not as intrinsically threatening as male homosexuals. Whether or not Christie herself inherited that tradition, that bias, is something that we could absolutely debate. I am not stating that as a fact. That is just a theory. But I do think it's telling that the two most rounded and sympathetic portrayals of gay characters, in my opinion, are portrayals of female homosexuals, Miss Casewell and then Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd from A Murder is Announced. Thank you, listener, for writing in, and my apologies to Miss Casewell, who does not appear in the original shorter version of this play in Three Blind Mice. She was added, but she is absolutely there in the play, and I should not have forgotten her. All right, next message. Hello, Kemper. Happy Pride. The latest episode was very interesting, and you raised a point that matters a lot to me. The way people assume that people who choose to live alone are automatically hiding something. But I contend we can go even further. To me, Poirot is not concealing a latent homosexuality. He is asexual. It's made really clear that his body is a constant source of inconvenience to him. He's cold, hungry, seasick, his feet hurt, etc., while his mind is the only thing he truly cares about. There's no sexuality for such a person who values his little gray cells above all. That doesn't mean that he can't love or have crushes. He has friends and he has canonically admired two different women, but never the prospect of a sexual relationship with these women is raised. There are people out there who are not living alone because they can't face their true nature or because nobody wants them around, but who do it just because they prefer it that way. To me, Poirot exemplifies that. I'm an introvert myself, and it took me over 40 years to be able to own the fact that I don't want to share my personal space with somebody, and that children are not for me. So I find it important to have people who represent that point of view without being judged for choosing that lifestyle. It's an interesting discussion to have anyway, so thanks again for the podcast. And thank you, listener, for that heartfelt message. I absolutely think you have something there. And, I replied to this listener, and I mentioned that the reason I chose to use the term LGBTQIA+ rather than the shorter LGBT, for instance, is that there are a panoply of, I don't want to say new to me, identities out there, and I think it's important to acknowledge them. Apparently, I could have gone even further and said LGBTQIA+, the U standing for undefined, which is a nice umbrella term. I also love being able to put Q and U next to each other whenever I possibly can. That pleases the pedant in me. But anyway, I think these are exactly the sorts of conversations we should be having in this day and age. Is Poirot asexual? You make a heck of a good argument for that, listener, and I really appreciate your writing in with that personal message. Thank you. All right, next up. So, good news and bad news regarding Miss Marple and homophobia. Bad news is, I think you're correct about what Miss Marple is implying about Haley Preston in The Mirror Cracked. I don't know any other way to interpret that. The good news is that there are positive moments for Miss Marple as well. You mentioned A Murder is Announced, and you alluded to this briefly, but in A Caribbean Mystery, there is that passage where Raymond West wonders if Miss Marple knows what queer people are. In that same passage, we learn a queer friend of Raymond West is actually staying in Miss Marple's house and watching it while she is on holiday. And Miss Marple seemingly approves of this. Of course, it is mentioned subtly, and perhaps I read too much into this, that she feels comfortable knowing her garden will be taken care of. But hey, he's not an architect at least. I think he was one of Raymond West's novelist friends. I also think the reason why we see more gay or gay-coded characters in Miss Marple than Poirot is because the subject is one Christie is more comfortable talking about more overtly in her later years with the passage of time. A lot of the Poirots are in the 1930s when she just wouldn't have talked about this. Even Mrs. McGinty's Dead, where I'm not so sure about Robin Upward, is a very Marple-like novel that features Poirot. I think you mentioned this at one point in a past episode, but that book was also supposed to have a cottage of two men living together in an implied relationship, and they had to be removed because Christie needed more female characters because of the whole women who killed backstory. And I'll just pause there. That is so true about the male couple who Christie toyed with putting into Mrs. McGinty's Dead. I failed to mention that in my last episode, and I think that just buttresses my theory about Robin Upward. And this listener is absolutely right about A Caribbean Mystery. I probably should have read out the relevant section during my previous episode. But very early in the book, we learn that the kind and conscientious Raymond West has sent his dear Aunt Jane on a holiday to the Caribbean. Apparently, she had a bad go of pneumonia the winter before, and her doctor said that she needed sunshine. Maybe that was Dr. Haydock, although we are in the 60s at this point, so he's probably retired by now. And Christie writes, Raymond had dealt with everything. A friend who was writing a book wanted a quiet place in the country. He'll look after the house, all right. He's very house proud. He's a queer. I mean, he had paused, slightly embarrassed. But surely even dear old Aunt Jane must have heard of queers. I mentioned that this is an instance of Christie using the word queer to indicate gay, which is not always the case in her books, especially in her earlier books. But it looks as though Raymond is actually the one doing the stereotyping here, assuming that his friend is house proud because he is gay. And if you don't think those stereotypes persist, listeners, I once had a boss of mine in a previous job request that I specifically arrange a tray of cookies for an upcoming meeting. This is when I was an assistant, because you're good at that sort of thing, right? The implication was very clear. There was an assumption being made. So these things do happen, and we have a pretty benign instance of it in A Caribbean Mystery, where Miss Marple, I think, acquits herself pretty well. So I like looking at that as an antidote of sorts to that troubling passage in The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. Thank you for that, listener. And this listener is not done. The message continues. I'd also like to comment on the gays never did it concept. I'm not necessarily in favor of this. If you look at the pool of murderers in Christie, they are almost exclusively white, straight, and able-bodied, except for the rats, as you mentioned, and death comes as the end. This has not changed much at all over time. I absolutely think diversity of all kinds is needed in the murderer characters. For one, it makes modern-day mysteries very predictable, as, at least I know, the killer isn't going to be certain people right off the bat. I absolutely think writers can make any character a murderer without having to make the motive about their sexuality, race, religion, etc. I have one friend who is African American, and she often complains about the lack of diversity amongst Disney villains because she loves Disney villains, but there are almost no black Disney villains. It's sort of the same thing here. And there are a few mystery novelists writing in the time of late career Christie who did use the surprise, this person is gay and is the murderer twist. And if you overlook the uncomfortableness of that, it's actually quite a shocking twist for the day. Ruth Rendell and Ellery Queen both did this, and the message is actually a positive one, although that is overlooked by some of the stuff that did not age well. In the Ellery Queen novel, which was written in response to the Stonewall riots, the message is that society failed the gay killer by telling him he wasn't normal and forcing him to repress himself and hide in the closet. That message does get lost nowadays because there are the typical array of gay jokes that don't age well, and the portrayal of that character is also not good, even though it is supposed to be. It's been a while since I read the Ruth Rendell novel, but I believe that one has mostly the same message, and I think readers of the day would be shocked by it. Thank you for those thoughts as well, listener. And they actually dovetail with the thoughts that I got from another listener. So before I respond to that second part of the message, I'm going to read out this message as well. I'm wondering, why should a gay culprit in a Christie novel be considered a problem? Certainly, a disproportionate level of gay villains would suggest homophobia, but isn't the idea of the genre that anyone could be a killer? And why should the fear of exposure as being gay be sneered at as a motive? In a society in which homosexuality was grounds for not only public disgrace but even imprisonment, wouldn't exposure of it seem a very solid murder motive? These points are more than fair enough, and I think what they tell me is that I didn't properly contextualize the points I was making in my last episode when I commended Christie for not picking a gay character as a murderer. My point was that within the context of Christie's characterization of these gay characters, which was not uniformly bad or cartoonish or one-dimensional, we can always point to Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd as a counterexample, and even Miss Casewell. Even though I'm not arguing that Christie's depictions of these gay characters were always bad, they weren't great. They tended not to get the nuanced depiction, the complex and layered treatment that I think many of the best Christie characters did, so that if they had been made into the murderers, I don't think it would be a very satisfying experience. But I am not advocating that gay characters should never be the murderers in a murder mystery. Quite to the contrary, and forgive the slight tangent, but it makes me think of an interview I remember watching or maybe reading with Laverne Cox, the actress in the TV series Orange is the New Black. And she was portraying a character who was a transgender woman, and she herself is a transgender woman. And like almost all the characters on that show, she is a criminal. She is in jail for having done something illegal. And she talked about how there were people who told her before the show came out, you can't play this character. This is one of the first trans roles played by a trans actor, and you can't have this character be bad. That won't be a good thing for the community. And her response to that was, no. Trans people need to be able to be bad sometimes, just like every other type of person out there needs to be able to be bad sometimes and to be good sometimes. And I think these two listeners are making the same point. And it's an excellent point. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think in a perfect world, Christie's depiction of these characters would be on the same level as her depiction of other characters. And in that case, yes. Let's have a Mr. Pye or a Mr. Ellsworthy or what have you be the murderer. But that's simply not the case. Even though Christie acquitted herself rather well in this area because many of her contemporaries simply did not include gay characters or had gay characters who were much more narrowly stereotyped and even sometimes villainized. Okay, 2 more responses to my All About the Gays episode. Hi, Kemper, longtime listener, first-time caller. I just listened to your wonderful Pride episode, which I absolutely loved. As a bisexual woman who grew up on Christie, finding your podcast years ago and hearing a Christie specialist who also belongs to the LGBTQIA+ community has been wonderful. And listening to this episode and wondering which parts you were going to mention next was a lot of fun. I'd like to share some thoughts I had during the episode, and that I would like to maybe hear your thoughts on in a future mailbag episode. About Satterthwaite, I wondered if you were going to mention him, because while I do dabble in some Mr. Satterthwaite, Mr. Quinn shipping, there are some lovely fanfics out there, my very 21st century take on him being a part of the queer community isn't centered as much on his sexuality as on his gender identity. This isn't what Agatha had in mind when she repeatedly wrote him as having a great deal of the feminine in him, of course, but although the vocabulary and the freedom for non-binary people to express themselves is new in our current society, as other cultures had accepted identities outside of the binary long ago, but that's a different topic, non-binary people themselves have always existed, and it is completely possible that Agatha may have based the character on someone she'd met who didn't fit in the gender binary. I'm cis, but I've spoken about Satterthwaite with non-binary friends, and they agreed it's a valid interpretation. I'll just pause here. That is very interesting to me, and of course, I think it's a valid interpretation, and I really appreciate you bringing that up. All right, back to this message. I really liked you explicitly talking about the possibility of Sven Hirsen being gay, because my speculation on that scene has always been that it's interesting that it's about a fictional detective with the initials SH being shipped in adaptations with a female antagonist with a name beginning with an I, when his author has made it very clear that he doesn't care for women. The thought of Agatha Christie throwing shade at people who tried to force a romance between Sherlock Holmes and Irene Adler, and in fact having the character who attempted to do so be the murderer at the end, always makes me smile. All right, pausing again. Wow, that is some deep diving there, listener. I love that you were reading a Sherlock Holmes and Irene Adler allusion into Robin Upward's treatment of Sven Hirsen. That is fantastic. As one who reads these texts just as closely as you do, I love it. Okay, back to the message. And this listener really saved the best part for last here. The last thing I'd like to mention is that, given your love of Christie's autobiography, I was surprised you didn't quote a rather charming passage in the chapters about her childhood. Sadly, I don't have my book with me at the moment to find the exact wording, but she describes how when she felt lonely at home, she'd pretend to be away at boarding school, and how she made up an entire class of imaginary friends who she kept imagining growing up through the years. I believe she imagined them all grown until their mid-20s or something of the sort. Two of these imaginary friends started out as little girls who were very close to each other, one of whom was bold and tomboyish, and another who was quiet and delicate and always being protected by her friend. At the end of the passage about these imaginary friends, Agatha describes the type of man she imagined each of them settling down with, and when it gets to those two, she says that she always knew they would never marry, but would naturally live together. I always found that passage rather sweet and heartwarming, even if it does lead to rather morbid thoughts on whether these two were the first basis for our dear Murgatroyd and Hinch. That is fantastic, listener, and I can't believe that I forgot about the girls. Agatha Christie does write about the girls. They were these characters who she created in her head, this group of girls who all had distinct looks and personalities, and they grew up with her, even though it's true, once they reached their early 20s, they didn't really get any older, even as Agatha Christie did, but she thought about them throughout her entire life. And the first two girls she created in her head were Ethel Smith and Annie Gray. And I, of course, do have Agatha Christie's autobiography in front of me, so I'm going to read from it now. Ethel Smith was 11 and Annie was 9. Ethel was dark with a great mane of hair. She was clever, good at games, had a deep voice, and must have been rather masculine in appearance. Annie Gray, her great friend, was a complete contrast. She had pale flaxen hair, blue eyes, and was shy and nervous and easily reduced to tears. She clung to Ethel, who protected her on every occasion. I liked them both, but my preference was for the bold and vigorous Ethel. And clearly Ethel is Miss Hinchcliffe. So I guess that's why Murgatroyd got the axe. Just the proverbial axe. And then this is how she ends that section. And it's exactly as this listener described. They were, of course, in due time married off or remained unmarried. Ethel never married, but lived in a small cottage with the gentle Annie. Very appropriate, I think, now. It's exactly what they would have done in real life. And let's not forget that Agatha Christie was writing her autobiography in the mid-1960s. I think she is definitely alluding to the fact that Ethel and Annie were a lesbian couple, and she loved them, and they are totally the basis for Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd. I'm convinced of that, at least. Thank you so much for writing in, listener. That was a delightful message. And then this is my last message about the gaze of Agatha Christie. And I think this one's really interesting because it makes a connection between a murder is announced and after the funeral that I had never made before. Hi there. I listened to the podcast and I wanted to say a theory regarding some of the characters you spoke about who could be gay-coded in Agatha Christie. For reference, I just finished reading A Murder is Announced, and I found it interesting that in the story, Miss Blacklock mentions that she doesn't have a hidden Rembrandt painting in her house as a means of motive for killing her. I picked up on this and wondered if Christie was referencing After the Funeral, but found out that came out 3 years later. So it was interesting that she foreshadowed or was considering this as a motive for a crime in 1950. That's my trivia, but it ties into my other bit. I wanted to argue the idea that Cora and her companion were lovers. The first reason is because, like in A Murder is Announced, Christie more or less openly had a lesbian couple featured, and that book came out 3 years before this book. My second reason is the fact that other characters bring up the suggestion that Cora and her companion might have been more than master and servant. And third, I think the means of murder is the most important clue. If Cora and Miss Gilchrist were lovers, and if the relationship was in a power imbalance, then it makes sense that Miss Gilchrist would harbor some hatred or strong feelings for wanting Cora dead. I think this explains why Miss Gilchrist brutally murdered Cora. I think it was a crime of passion, because using such force on an elderly woman who was drugged wasn't necessary. Also, the attempted murder on the aunt was less physical, a doorstop dropped on her. I think the reason for this was because Miss Gilchrist didn't harbor the same strong feelings of wanting the aunt dead like she did Cora. Also, I don't think Christie could openly say that they were a couple, but she could hint at it like she did in A Murder is Announced. What do you think? I think that you make very good points, listener. I do remember others bringing up the fact that there could be an ulterior motive in the brutal murder of Cora, in that Miss Gilchrist has impersonated Cora. And if Cora herself is made to be unrecognizable, that will help Miss Gilchrist pulling off her overall scheme. But I think Christie often adds such elements for more than one reason. I think that both those reasons are valid for why the murder of Cora is as savage as it is and as disfiguring to the body of Cora Lansquenet. And I really love the parallels that you draw between After the Funeral and A Murder is Announced. A separation of 3 years in terms of publication dates is not very far when it comes to Agatha Christie, given how quickly she wrote and how much of a queue she had, even into the early 1950s. So it's very possible that the writing, or at least the planning of those two books, wasn't too far apart. Very, very interesting. All right, moving on now to a comment on my 10 Little Poirots and Marples episode, in which I was ranking the actors who have played our dear Monsieur Poirot and Miss Marple. I enjoyed your episode ranking the Poirots and Marples. I would be remiss if I didn't mention you did not include Hugh Laurie, who played Poirot in the Spice Girls movie Spice World.
Alors, ladies and gentlemen, 4 horrible murders perpetrated by the same ruthless psychopath. Each victim riddled with 100 machine gun bullets by this unknown maniac. But who is it? Professor Schutzmann? Father Conan Murphy? Lady Matilda Davenport? Or Miss Emma Bunton?
Of course, this was not a serious or big role, but he wouldn't be last, I bet. As you can hear in that clip, Hugh Laurie's turn as Poirot is very much a spoof of David Suchet's rendering of Poirot specifically. Back to this listener's message. Alfred Molina also played Poirot in a recent stage adaptation of Murder on the Links, in which he received good reviews. It was for the LA Theatre Works alongside Simon Helberg, who played Hastings. I didn't see it, so I cannot assess it, but perhaps Molina achieved some redemption as Poirot. And the person who wrote in about David Suchet, this listener thought his name was Stephen, but his name is in fact Scott Ratner, friend of the podcast. He wrote in with his thoughts on David Suchet's performance as Poirot. This listener has some thoughts on Scott's thoughts, namely, to each his own. But Scott is incorrect in saying Poirot never cried in the books. He cries in The Mysterious Affair at Styles when he learns of Mrs. Inglethorpe's death because he appreciated all she did for Belgian refugees like himself. There are also other times when Poirot becomes very emotional, so I don't find Suchet to be not complying with the text on that. Thank you very much for this message, listener. I am embarrassed, or perhaps actually really proud, to say that I have never watched Spice World. Even though at one point I could definitely sing the entirety of Wannabe, like a cappella, without having to look at the lyrics. It was the late 90s, what can I say? God help us all. All right, I now have 2 messages from listeners in response to my episode on the actress. Both of these messages are just a nice reminder that audiobooks are a very viable option where Christie is concerned. And I don't really talk about audiobooks that much on this podcast because I don't consume books as audiobooks, but I know a lot of you do increasingly as time goes on. So I just wanted to air their celebration of Agatha Christie audiobooks. Here goes. I just finished listening to the latest episode. I'm sure others have already pointed out, but the actress also appears in the Harlequin tea set and other stories. I have been eagerly anticipating you covering a favorite of mine from that collection called The Lonely God. It rates at the same level for me as The Man from the Sea, which I know you and Catherine also enjoyed very much. Sigh, Mr. Quinn and Mr. Satterthwaite. Heart. You spoke in the episode about covering some additional short stories, and I hope this makes the cut soon. There are several short stories that I re-listen to when I am trying to decide what to read next. I began reading Christie during the pandemic and had not previously tried audiobooks. I got through all of them and just keep going back. What prompted me to finally write is that I wanted to encourage others to give listening a try if they haven't. Those 2 short stories in particular that I mentioned are so comforting to me when listened to, and I do that as an escape whenever I need it. Thank you for that, listener, and here's the second message. I listen to you on Spotify, along with Caroline Crampton of She Done It fame, and Patreon, and have recently discovered there is a treasure trove of classic crime there for premium Spotify subscribers like myself. As well as audiobooks, there are many radio plays. My most recent find is Agatha Christie, 12 Radio Mysteries from BBC4, published in 2016. They are also available on many other platforms. I can highly recommend these. The adaptations range from straight to some highly creative choices. Several of the short stories have been very successfully brought into the 21st century. For example, the case of the perfect maid becomes the case of the perfect carer. And the casts are stellar, with many well-known British actors taking part. I was previously something of a purist regarding adaptations, but you have convinced me to be more open-minded, which had made listening to these a very interesting exercise. Apologies if you are already familiar with them. However, I'd love to share them with the broader audience of Agatha Files. Thank you for that as well, listener. And that was really more about radio plays than audiobooks per se. But both of those messages are about the joy of listening to Agatha Christie, for what it's worth, and I think it's worth a lot. All right, I have one more message in response to my episode all about The Actress by Agatha Christie. And this one is actually coming from one of my previous guest co-hosts. That would be Michelle Casmer, Agatha Christie scholar extraordinaire. So she wrote to me about a really interesting connection that she saw between the setup in The Actress and in the mysterious Mr. Quinn short story, The Soul of the Croupier. Basically, and I'm going to have to paraphrase this a little bit because we went back and forth a bit. In The Actress, we had a man who recognized a woman from his past, and who was in a position to do that woman great harm. In that short story, in The Actress, he does just that, or at least he tries to harm this woman. He tries to blackmail her, and he does not succeed because that woman is very clever. In The Soul of the Croupier, we have very much the same setup, a man who recognizes a woman from his past, and he too is in a position to do this woman great harm. The man is the titular croupier, and the woman is the Countess Zarnova, who the croupier had actually married years and years ago. And she treated him horribly. She left him, and she went on to make her own path in the world, pretending to be this grand aristocratic character. So when they cross paths again at this casino in Monte Carlo, he has the ability to destroy her, especially because she is now in somewhat reduced circumstances. But what does this man do? This man does everything he can to save her. He is kind to this woman. He pretends that the Countess has won at the croupier table, even though she hasn't, and gives all of the winnings to her. And realizing what he has done for her, she literally lights all of the cash that he just gave her on fire. She uses it to light a cigarette. She spurns or scorns his charity. And I'm just going to read out the end of Michelle's message here. I'm not sure if scorned is the word I'd use. To me, the moment he realizes she's lit his cigarette with the franc note is just so exquisite. And what's really funny is if you read a synopsis in anyone else's words, the whole thing seems trite, maudlin, and manipulative. But reading it in Agatha's words, I think it's beautiful. And I so agree with that. So many of the mysterious Mr. Quinn stories are exquisitely written, and The Man from the Sea gets a lot of praise on this podcast, but it's worth praising The Soul of the Croupier as well. And I think when we compare the direction Agatha Christie goes in this story to what she does with such a similar setup in The Actress, we can see once again just how fertile her creative mind was. She really could spin gold out of a little straw nugget of a setup. And I just think that was a really perceptive observation on Michelle's part, and I wanted to share it with all of you. All right, I've got two more messages here, and then we are done with housekeeping. The first is regarding the novel Cat Among the Pigeons. I've just finished reading Cat Among the Pigeons and really enjoyed it. I can't believe it's taken me so long to read, given that it combines a murder mystery with a boarding school story, two of my favorite genres growing up. And obviously, the first thing I do when I finish reading a Christie is to listen to the podcast episode accompanying it. You should all do this, of course. As always, it's such fun to listen to you and Catherine discussing anything Christie. At the beginning of the episode, you discussed how Agatha Christie had considered whether it should be a Poirot or a Miss Marple book, but surely it should be Tommy and Tuppence. It would have been perfect, and there are a few ways she could have worked it. Their daughters, Deborah and Betty, could have attended Meadowbank School and taken the place of Julia Upjohn doing most of the investigating and finding the jewels. I'll just pause for a second. I love that idea, although I will note that there's such an age gap between Deborah and Betty that it would have to be one or the other. I love the idea of Betty being sent off to boarding school, though. All right, back to this message. They could then have traveled to London to find their parents and handed them over to them, in the same way that Julia travels to see Monsieur Poirot. Otherwise, Tommy could have taken the place of Adam as the undercover gardener, and Tuppence could have been a substitute teacher. This would have had similarities to their undercover work in NRM, and could have worked as Tommy and Tuppence tend to be much more active in their investigations. It would have added to the book's humor, although it might have detracted from the character of Miss Bulstrode, who was one of the strengths of the book. Although it isn't outlandish that Poirot has links to the world of international crime, it feels much more natural that Tommy and Tuppence would find themselves investigating political intrigue, espionage, and jewelry theft. It's their natural home. Although I do recognize that if Cat Among the Pigeons was a Tommy and Tuppence novel, we wouldn't get Poirot and Julia reminiscing about Mrs. Summerhays and her omelets, one of my favorite Christie moments. I'd love to know your thoughts. I love your Tommy and Tuppence riff on Cat Among the Pigeons, listener, especially because I think you acknowledge some of the great things that we would lose with a Tommy and Tuppence version of Cat Among the Pigeons. But in a lot of key ways, it really would be a more natural fit. Catherine and I called that a turducken of a novel because there are so many different subgenres stuffed into it. And Tommy and Tuppence are very much at home in that sort of a fractured landscape. So I totally get what you're saying here. Thank you for that. And now my final message has to do with a murder is announced. Here goes. Hi, Kemper. I hope all is well with you. I came across a random piece of history that connected with a murder is announced, and I wanted to share. It comes from a podcast called Stuff You Missed in History Class, and the episode was on iodized salt. Apologies if you listened to the same episode or are already familiar with this story. I'm not. Miss Marple mentions that Swiss doctors were doing some innovative treatments for goiter, and I believe the sisters actually went to Bern for Charlotte's treatment. I had assumed Christie chose Switzerland because it was on the continent and fashionable, to this American at least. According to the episode, parts of Switzerland had serious problems with goiters and hypothyroidism, as many places in the country lacked natural sources of iodine. Bern in particular was mentioned as a place that had a very high prevalence of thyroid problems, so their innovations were real and rooted in an actual medical need. Anyway, I just wanted to share. Have a great summer! You have a great summer too, listener, and that is very interesting. We should always give Agatha Christie credit for having very good reasons for all the choices that she makes in her books. But I had no idea about that, and I find it very interesting. All right, we are now done with our housekeeping. The mailbag is nice and empty once more, waiting for some more messages from all of you. So please do keep those emails coming, allaboutthedame@gmail.com. I love hearing from you. It is time to talk about the Americans of Agatha Christie. And before I get into the texts, I should, of course, mention the fact that Agatha Christie's father, Frederick Miller, was an American. And I've brought this up many, many times. I do realize that I'm repeating myself here, but I just have to repeat myself, so bear with me. Did you know that at one point in the, late 19th century, Agatha Christie's father and Winston Churchill's mother had a little bit of a flirtation, and they were both Americans? I just love that. It really tickles me, the idea that these two Americans, who had nothing to do with each other, would each go on to produce an icon of British culture. And I think we could really make the argument that having one American parent makes you that much more British, especially if the American parent in question is one's mother. Because that was the way it traditionally worked. And we've seen fictional renderings of this in Edith Wharton's The Buccaneers, in Julian Fellowes' Downton Abbey. The rich American daughters of American millionaires would marry into the impoverished British aristocracy, thereby infusing these estates with some much needed cash. And the children of these unions would continue to be just as English as they ever were. That is not the way it worked for Agatha Christie. Her father was the one who was American. But he passed away, as we know, when she was still a child, and she was extremely close to her mother, which isn't to say that she had no experience of her American relations. And this brings up an interesting question, and one that I had never pondered directly until I was researching this episode. How many visits did Agatha Christie make to the United States? We know that she made one visit in 1922. That's when she did her round the world tour, which included a stint in the United States. She stayed with her father's relatives in New York. We also know that she made a trip over 40 years later in 1966. On this trip, she saw her grandfather's grave in Brooklyn. She met lots of archaeological associates of her husband's, of Max Mallowan's, including Dr. Ernestine Elster, who ran into her at a party in Beverly Hills. I spoke with Dr. Elster about that run-in on this very podcast in one of my favorite episodes, Agatha Christie in the Flesh. That was also the trip during which she observed the Halloween festivities in the United States and used some of them in her late 60s book, Halloween Party. So that's 2 visits. And it seems that there was at least one other visit somewhere in and around 1957, since she toyed with the idea of visiting the set of Billy Wilder's Witness for the Prosecution, though she ultimately didn't. We also know that she visited the Caribbean, which inspired A Caribbean Mystery. So she made a few trips to the United States, though perhaps not as many as I would have thought for one as well-traveled as she. I don't think there was a whole lot of transatlantic travel happening in the late 1930s and most of the 1940s, given world events. So perhaps that also accounts for the big gap between the 1922 visit and then the late 50s visit. But Agatha Christie was not a stranger to the United States. And yet, the way that Americans tend to be treated in the oeuvre sometimes feels a little bit like they are an alien species. And we'll get into that as we now go through my top 10 Americans in the Christie canon, which, of course, ballooned into my top dozen Americans in the Christie canon. So starting at number 12, we've got Eurydice Spragg from Motive versus Opportunity. That is an early Miss Marple short story. It appears in the collected 13 Problems. Eurydice's husband is also an American named Absalom Spragg. And as we can see right from the start with these 2 character names, Christie often gave her American characters really outlandish names. They often have outdated, old-fashioned, kind of grandiose, grotesque sounding names like Eurydice and Absalom. And I also just have to mention that last name Spragg, Spragg, which is also pretty outlandish. I wonder if Christie is referencing, either consciously or subconsciously, The Custom of the Country by Edith Wharton, which is a wonderfully dark novel of Wharton's featuring the heroine, I am heavily using air quotes here, the heroine Undine Spragg. Let's just say that Undine is a piece of work. You love to hate her. Seriously, if you haven't read The Custom of the Country, you absolutely should. And in this short story, Eurydice Spragg is a psychic medium who we are meant to distrust, who we are meant to think is a charlatan. And at the end of the story, the Spraggs end up not getting the inheritance that they had been trying to secure. And we are definitely supposed to be happy about that. It's not entirely spelled out whether or not the Spraggs are complete frauds, but I honestly think that's because Christie didn't think she had to spell it out. It's just so obvious that the Spraggs are awful. So these are, I think, 2 of the ugliest Americans within a menagerie of ugly Americans in Christie. So that is why they are in 12th place here. In 11th place, we have Pedro Morales from Sparkling Cyanide. And the reason I have Pedro Morales on this list is that this goes to the heart of American dialogue in Christie, because when American characters appear in Christie, they tend to speak with a great deal of slang and idiom. It's very jarring and I think sometimes unintentionally comedic. But let's also not dismiss Christie here, because I think often when this language appears in her books, it appears there for a reason. So this is what Pedro Morales sounds like when he is interviewed about halfway through the book. Went with Chrissy. That baby is sure hard-boiled. She said it was a good joint. Honey pie, I said, we'll go just where you say. It was a classy joint, that I'll admit. And do they know how to charge you? Set me back the best part of $30, but the band was punk. They just couldn't seem to swing it. Woo! That is not the way a real person speaks. But you know what? Pedro Morales is not a real person. Surprise! He is a disguise. A persona being put on by Victor Drake, who is one of the two murderers working in cahoots with that devious secretary Ruth Lessing. So Christie has faked us out here. And if we noted the artificiality of that dialogue, then good for us. All right, in 10th place, we've got Mrs. Calvin Baker from Destination Unknown. And when we first meet Mrs. Calvin Baker in this fairly late Christie thriller, she seems like the typical American tourist. But since we're in an Agatha Christie thriller, she, of course, turns out to be an evil American-hating spy. That's right. She is a total traitor to the American cause. And I kind of like thinking about her as a dark twin to another American pretending to be someone other than she is, who we will get to a little later on this list. Let's move on now to number 9, Carlotta Adams from Lord Edgware Dies. This is a very talented actor and impersonator who was very much inspired by the real-life actor and impersonator Ruth Draper, who was also an American. And Carlotta is super talented. Her ability to impersonate one Jane Wilkinson ends up costing poor Carlotta dearly. She is killed. And I still count the moment that Poirot contemplates her young, lifeless body as one of the most quietly moving ones in all the oeuvre. There's just a lot of wasted potential there. And Poirot is very sad about it. Carlotta Adams has stuck with me, actually. And this is not the last that we will be hearing of the book, Lord Edgware Dies. Stay tuned. All right, in 8th place, we've got Lucky Dyson from A Caribbean Mystery. Lucky has the misfortune of being blonde, just like Molly Kendall, which is why Lucky ends up getting killed, because Molly's homicidal husband thinks that he's killing Molly. So in this way, Lucky is a victim, but it turns out Lucky was also a murderer. She did away with her husband Greg's first wife. This is not central to the story, but it's central to who she is. And I like this duality in her character. She's both victim and murderer, which feels appropriate to her nationality. We Americans can be a tricksy people. In 7th place, we've got Ruth Van Rydock from They Do It With Mirrors. Technically, Ruth's sister, Carrie Louise, is also American, but Carrie Louise has lived in England long enough that I think it's fair to call her English. Ruth, on the other hand, is very American, and the opening scene of this book, in which Ruth visits with her old school chum, Miss Jane Marple, is just fantastic. Ruth, Carrie Louise, and Jane all went to school together, a sort of finishing school abroad in Italy, and Ruth is now asking Miss Marple to check in on Carrie Louise because she's worried about her. Here is our first glimpse of Ruth Van Rydock. Mrs. Van Rydock stood in front of the glass in her peach satin slip. She was exquisitely corseted. Her still shapely legs were encased in fine nylon stockings. Her face, beneath a layer of cosmetics and constantly toned up by massage, appeared almost girlish at a slight distance. Her hair was less gray than tending to hydrangea blue and was perfectly set. It was practically impossible when looking at Mrs. Van Rydock to imagine what she would be like in a natural state. Everything that money could do had been done for her, reinforced by diet, massage, and constant exercises. And then that obnoxious Ruth Van Rydock goes on to ask Miss Jane Marple, "Do you think most people would guess, Jane, that you and I are practically the same age?" And of course, Miss Marple responds, "Nah." Miss Marple really doesn't care that she looks older because she doesn't look insane. But that is what rich, aging Americans do in Christie novels. They try to slow down or stop the aging process altogether. It's actually unfortunate that we don't get any more Ruth Van Rydock other than in this opening scene. I think They Do It With Mirrors would be a lot better for some more Ruth Van Rydock in it. But I really love this character, who is officially the first of the Vans on this list. Agatha Christie, in addition to giving her American characters outlandish first names, would often, though not always, give them Dutch-sounding last names that started with Van. I suppose because a lot of Dutch people settled the New World. It is true that there are a lot of Dutch families, especially in the eastern United States, but she does it maybe a little too much. As evidenced by my next selection, number 6, Marie Van Schuyler. Miss Van Schuyler appears in Death on the Nile, and at one point she actually references Rufus Van Alden, another American Van who appears in The Mystery of the Blue Train. And both Miss Van Schuyler and Mr. Van Alden are rich Americans. They probably also know the Van Ryn family from Julian Fellowes' The Gilded Age. I'm just going to name check all of Julian Fellowes' shows on this episode, apparently. Miss Van Schuyler is a fun enough character in the book, but let's be honest, the main reason that she appears in the number 6 slot here is that Bette Davis plays her in the 1978 Peter Ustinov adaptation to Chef's Kiss Perfection.
This place is beginning to resemble a mortuary.
Thank God you'll be in one yourself before too long. Bloody old fossil.
Temper, Bowers. What you need is a nice, cool holiday. I was thinking of a trip through the Gobi Desert.
Thank you, Bette Davis. All right, next up in the number 5 slot, we've got a character from another Christie crown jewel. That would be Murder on the Orient Express, and the character in question is Caroline Hubbard, but I'm going to have to use quotes around that name because Caroline Hubbard doesn't actually exist. She is, in fact, the famous actor Linda Arden. So I reread Murder on the Orient Express recently for a very exciting reason that I will be sharing with you shortly in a future episode. But upon my reread, I was really struck by what a dramatic impact Linda Arden has when she reveals herself to be who she really is, compared to all that comedic rambling she does as the windbag American traveler, Mrs. Hubbard. And I have a really fun fact about Mrs. Hubbard that I did not have when Catherine and I covered Murder on the Orient Express for the podcast. So apparently, Christie based this character on an actual passenger she came across on the Orient Express. She first took that train in real life in 1928. That was the first time that she went to Iraq and Syria. And she would, of course, use this train many, many times in the future to go back to the Middle East once she married Max Mallowan. And it was just before Christmas in 1931 that she had an experience on the Orient Express that she used in this book. I'm getting this from Janet Morgan's biography of Christie. Janet Morgan reproduces a long letter that Christie wrote to Max about parts of the train track getting alternately washed out and snowed in, resulting in days and days of delays on this train trip in December of 1931. And in that letter, she mentions, quote, an elderly American lady, end quote, and that lady's name was Mrs. Hilton. And Mrs. Hilton complained about the way the train was run. She said that this would never happen in the United States. Christie actually quotes her in the letter, but why aren't they doing anything? Why, in the States, they'd have motored some automobiles along right away. Why, they'd have brought aeroplanes. She also records Mrs. Hilton talking about her daughter. My daughter said I'd have no trouble at all. No trouble at all. I've never traveled in Europe before, and I'll never travel in it again. So obviously, Mrs. Hilton is the basis for Mrs. Hubbard. And Christie did this a lot. She would see people, especially while she was traveling, people she didn't necessarily know very well, or who she knew fleetingly, who she knew she would never see again. And then she would use them in her books as inspiration for characters who she could then make her own. She talked about her discomfort at using people who she knew really well because she didn't feel like she had ownership over those people. They were their own person, but someone who she met incidentally, she could kind of make her own because she could use her own powers of invention to fill them out. She did this in Appointment with Death. She did it in The Body in the Library. I feel certain she did it a whole lot more than that. Those are just two examples that spring to mind. And I love that she did it here with this Mrs. Hilton. Mrs. Hubbard is a great, great character. Okay, next up, in fourth place, we're getting pretty high here, people. We've got Fenella Gutman. You don't know who Fenella Gutman is? Well, for most of the book in which she appears, she goes by Ellie Rogers. That's right, the main victim of Endless Night, the poor, sweet Ellie Rogers, is an American. And true story, but before I recorded this episode, I actually asked former guest co-host and friend of the podcast, Brad Friedman, another American Christie scholar, just to look over my list to make sure I wasn't forgetting anyone major. And Brad is the one who reminded me that Ellie Rogers is American, so she would not be appearing on this list if it wasn't for him. Thank you, Brad. I think the reason I forgot about her is that she really doesn't fit into the stereotype that I have constructed for Agatha Christie's supposedly stereotyped Americans. She is rich, this is true, but she's not obnoxious or pushy. I think more than anything, she's good-natured. And as Brad noted to me, there is a smaller subset of quote-unquote jolly girl Americans in Christie. The other character from the canon who probably best fits this mold is Sally Finch from Hickory Dickory Dock. That is a book populated by all sorts of young people from all over the world. And I love the fact that Christie did something a little different here with Ellie. She is not haughty and overbearing. You could argue she does have a somewhat weird first name, Vanilla, but her nickname matches her personality, and she's a breath of fresh air on this list. And that is the reason I'm giving her such prime placement here in fourth place. All right, moving on now to our top 3 Americans in Agatha Christie. In third place, getting our bronze medal, is Lynette Doyle, née Ridgway. And yes, it's true, Lynette is half American. We learn right when she is introduced at the very start of the novel that her mother was an American, the only daughter of one of those millionaire blokes. Her name was Anna Hartz, and her father's name was Melhuish Ridgway. Melhuish is a very English name, specifically from Devon, so we know that Lynette is half English, half American here. And I did argue earlier in my discussion that having one American parent, in particular an American mother, makes one even more English or British. But you know what? I couldn't resist putting Lynette on this list, because to a certain extent, she is the archetypal ugly American of Christie. Not on the outside, of course. On the outside, she is lovely. Here is our first glimpse of her jumping out of a big scarlet Rolls Royce. A girl jumped out, a girl without a hat and wearing a frock that looked, but only looked, simple. A girl with golden hair and straight, autocratic features. A girl with a lovely shape. A girl such as was seldom seen in Malton Underwood. Lynette might look lovely, but she is one of Christie's least sympathetic murder victims, paired with one of Christie's most sympathetic murderers, I would argue, at least where Poirot is concerned. It is very clear in this book that Poirot does not like Lynette and very much vibes with Jacqueline de Belfort. And I think the fact that Lynette is half American sells this unsavory aspect of her character. And to be clear, she is a fantastic character. I mean, she is one of the 3 points of perhaps Christie's greatest love triangle. So I had to include Lynette here in the top 3. Moving on now to number 2, my silver medalist. And this would be Marina Gregg from The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. Let's never forget that even though the official line from Christie and the Christie estate is that she never knew about the real-life actor Gene Tierney's tragic life story, the fictional backstory of Marina Gregg really does match Gene Tierney's. Marina gives birth to a child who has severe developmental issues due to complications from contracting German measles while pregnant, due to an overzealous fan wanting to interact with her. This is precisely what happened to Gene Tierney. It feels like a very specific backstory to have coincidentally created, so perhaps there was some subconscious pop cultural osmosis happening here. In any case, Marina is a fabulous character. She murders 3 people over the course of this book. She pretends that someone is trying to poison her. She also treats her adopted children horribly. And yet, somehow, we have sympathy for her. I think Marina Gregg is one of Christie's best portrayals of a murderer. One of the 1,000 things that Christie does better than most mystery writers is to manage to convey to us from the start precisely who the murderer is, so that when the solution is revealed, we don't have to recalibrate our sense of this character. The solution makes perfect sense. It lines up with what we already know, and that keeps the character intact and makes the solution that much more satisfying because it feels inevitable. Christie doesn't do this every time, but she does it a lot, and I think that Marina Gregg is one of her best examples of pulling this off beautifully. Once we learn that Marina Gregg did it, it makes perfect sense that she did what she did. And I think it would have been so easy for Christie to veer into caricature with Marina Gregg. She's this larger-than-life American actress who swans into St. Mary Mead, and she's gussied up Gossington Hall, but she always feels like a real person. There really isn't the camp factor that we get in the Elizabeth Taylor, Kim Novak, Angela Lansbury film adaptation, for instance. Marina is grounded and knowable and believable, and very American. And I'll just note about her first name. Technically, this is yet another weirdo, old-fashioned American name, but it works. For once, it works. Marina is a Shakespearean name. She is a main character of the play Pericles, which Shakespeare wrote at least half of, if not all of. It's a very theatrical name. She feels like a Marina, and the name really enhances the character. All right, it is time to crown our winner, our gold medalist, our top American in Christie. I mentioned that we would be returning to Lord Edgware Dies. You probably saw this coming, listeners. With apologies to my former co-host, Catherine Brobeck, who is shaking her fist at me somewhere right now, I am going to give the crown to Jane Wilkinson from Lord Edgware Dies. Jane Wilkinson is another fabulous actress, and I think another example of Christie showing us precisely who our murderer is, so that when we get to our solution, we feel like we should have known all along. I maintain that Lord Edgware Dies is a devilish puzzle. I think it's one of Christie's most ingenious. And at its core, I think lies one of the very best, the very cleverest murderers in the canon. I really can hear Catherine groaning right now. And to prove what a great character she is, I'm just going to read out the final lines of Lord Edgware Dies, which are the final lines of this letter that Jane Wilkinson writes to Poirot, confessing everything. She's writing this letter from prison. I look much paler and thinner, but it suits me somehow. They all say I'm wonderfully brave. They don't hang you in public anymore, do they? I think that's a pity. I'm sure there's never been a murderess like me before. I suppose I must say goodbye now. It's very queer. I don't seem to realize things a bit. I'm going to see the chaplain tomorrow. Yours forgivingly, because I must forgive my enemies, mustn't I? Jane Wilkinson. P.S. Do you think they will put me in Madame Tussaud's? And yes, I am allowed to pronounce that as Madame Tussaud's, because Jane Wilkinson is an American and probably would have pronounced it that way herself. I will just point out that 4 of the Americans on this list are actors: Carlotta Adams, Caroline Hubbard, really, Linda Arden, Marina Gregg, and Jane Wilkinson. And Eurydice Spragg was almost definitely a lying charlatan, which is pretty close to an actor in Christie. But I do think the reason this happened so many times is that the characteristics of actors in Christie and Americans in Christie overlap. They're both self-obsessed and pushy. They're both practiced in the fine art of deception. They're both good at getting other people to do their bidding. These are all very useful characteristics in a murder mystery. Also, and this truly wasn't intentional, 11 of my 12 top Americans are women. I did not realize that until after I made the list, but the sole man on this list is Pedro Morales, aka Victor Drake. Everyone else here is a woman, which is interesting. I do, of course, have some honorable mentions, so I'll be able to cover a few men here. First off, I just need to mention Murder on the Orient Express overall as a book, because it's the international nature of an American household that goes to the solution of the mystery. Poirot thinks to himself, where would you get such a disparate grouping of people from all over? And it occurs to him that an American household would have an English governess, a Swedish nurse, a German cook, etc., etc. Also, sticking with Murder on the Orient Express for a second, there are a bunch of other Americans in that book. We've got our victim, Samuel Ratchet, aka Cassetti, Hector McQueen, Helena Andregni, née Armstrong, Cyrus Hardman, and Antonio Foscarelli. He is our very stereotypical Italian American in that book. One could make the argument that Cyrus Hardman undoes the good work that Christie did in Sparkling Cyanide in terms of trying to make Americans sound hokey. Because there's this weird moment in Murder on the Orient Express where Cyrus Hardman has been pretending to be this traveling salesman for typewriting ribbons. And then he admits to Poirot halfway through the book that he's actually a hired detective. He works for McNeil's detective agency. And Christie writes, his whole personality seemed to undergo a change. He became less of a stage character and more of a real person. The resonant nasal tones of his voice became modified. But then when he starts talking, to me, it sounds pretty much as cliched and idiomatic as it did before. Poirot asks him to explain himself, and this is how he responds. Things came about this way. I'd come over to Europe trailing a couple of crooks. Nothing to do with this business. The chase ended in Istanbul. I wired the chief and got his instructions to return, and I would have been making my tracks back to little old New York when I got this. And it goes on from there. We also have a bunch of other Americans in Death on the Nile. Andrew Pennington, as well as Cornelia Robson and Miss Bowers, who are traveling with Miss Van Schuyler. The role of Miss Bowers was very much beefed up for Maggie Smith in the Ustinov adaptation, but Cornelia Robson, who was cut out of the film entirely, has a lot to do in the book. She's got a little love triangle of her own, so let's not forget them. I also wanted to give a special shout out to Halloween Party overall. And I already mentioned this at the top of the episode, but when Christie was traveling in the United States in 1966, she was there during the fall and she saw some of the Halloween festivities, which she has Ariadne Oliver describe at the beginning of Halloween Party. I went into great detail when Catherine and I covered Halloween Party about American traditions versus British traditions where Halloween is concerned. Many of you have contacted me since then to say that perhaps I was inflating the importance of American traditions over British traditions, that Halloween really is celebrated in the UK and has been for a while. Be that as it may, I think that the trip to the US was important in the creation of this book. So I just wanted to mention that. I also wanted to talk briefly about Odell C. Gardner and his wife, Carrie. They are an American couple who appear in Evil Under the Sun. This is another old-fashioned / elaborately first-named American, Odell. They aren't really suspects in the book. They are suspects in the Ustinov adaptation, and they're a lot of fun in that film, but they're also kind of fun in the book. Wife Carrie is constantly asking her husband to go get things for her, and you would think that he falls into the stereotype of the henpecked husband, but he actually has some real intelligence in the book. And Christie portrays them, I think, with some affection. I remember really liking the Gardners. I already mentioned Rufus Van Alden briefly in The Mystery of the Blue Train, and I will just as briefly mention his daughter, Ruth Kettering. They're rich. They're Americans. I don't know if there's all that much else to say there. And then we have another American, or seeming American, in Destination Unknown. Like Pedro Morales, it turns out that Andy Peters doesn't exist, but is actually Boris Glider, a Polish agent out to get justice for his sister's death, for the one actual murder that we learn very, very late in the book happened before the book started. Boris ends up with Hillary at the end, which makes our Andy Peters persona the unlikely romantic hero of the book. Okay, and then finally, I'm going to run through a number of Americans that we have in some Christie short stories. This is not an exhaustive list, but I did want to highlight a few of these. In Philomel Cottage, we have Gerald Martin, who also does not exist because he is actually Charles Lemaitre, a wife-killing serial killer from the United States. In The Adventure of the Western Star, we have yet another American actress, Mary Marvell. In The Soul of the Croupier, let's not forget Franklin Rouge and Elizabeth Martin. They are two more of the innocent/naive/good-natured young American types. In The Hound of Death, which I will be covering soon on Patreon, we have the American journalist William P. Ryan. In the Parker Pyne short story, The Pearl of Price, we've got Caleb Blundell, another somewhat questionably named American millionaire. He appears in that story along with his daughter, Carol. Dr. Alice Cunningham appears in The Capture of Cerberus. That would be the originally published version of The Capture of Cerberus, as opposed to the one that was published much more recently in one of John Curran's books. And then finally, we have the Californian Cucumber King, who gets referenced in the Parker Pyne short story, The Case of the Middle-Aged Wife. He is the husband to Mrs. Hattie West. These two characters are referenced at the very end of the story, but I just love the reference to the Californian Cucumber King as a Californian myself. And then I have just one final character to mention, listeners. This is actually from a novel. It's from a novel I did not enjoy very much, and which my former co-host, Catherine Brobeck, really did not enjoy. She absolutely loathed it. That would be The Big Four. But I had to mention this character in Catherine's honor because I remember how amused she was when we came across Abe Ryland, the Soap King, in The Big Four. This is another rich American millionaire who turned out to be number 2 of the Big Four. And that made Catherine, and I would imagine many of you, especially here in the United States, think of...
Hello, may I help you?
You can sure as hell try. Hi, I'm Abe Froman. Party of 3 for 12. Is there a problem?
You're Abe Froman.
That's right. I'm Abe Froman.
The Sausage King of Chicago.
Abe Froman, the Sausage King. In closing, listeners, I have to say that I was struck not only by the fact that there are so many Americans in the Christie canon, but by the fact that this overwhelming volume negates a lot of the stereotyping that Christie does when it comes to Americans. Sure, a lot of them have weird first names. Sure, a bunch of them have a last name that begins with Van. A whole heck of a lot of them are millionaires and overbearing and obnoxious. But for every one of these characteristics, we can produce an American who exhibits the opposite characteristic. We have not so wealthy Americans like Elizabeth Martin in The Soul of the Croupier, and nice Americans like Ellie Rogers in Endless Night, and Americans with normal names like, dare I say, Jane Wilkinson from Lord Edgware Dies. As usual, Agatha Christie does everything. I've said this before, and I'm sure I will say it again. Where Christie is concerned, more is more. That was The Americans of Agatha Christie. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. For my next episode, I will be interviewing David Morris of Collecting Christie. David is an avid collector of Christie books, manuscripts, and all sorts of other fascinating objects. And I was lucky enough to sit down with him in person and pore over some of these goodies that he brought for me to look at. And even though you can't be there in person with me, I think it is going to be a really great episode because we were able to talk about Christie's work in a very different way from what I usually do on this podcast. We talked about the formatting of her books and the covers and the dust jackets and what it's like to hold them, what they smell like. It's really interesting to consider these books as collector's pieces. I am not a collector myself, so I've never been able to do this before, and it was fascinating to be able to sit down with David and talk with him about being a collector of Christie with this material sitting right there between us. Can't wait to bring you that conversation. In the meantime, if you're looking for some bonus content, head on over to the Patreon page. I've got a link in the show notes. For July, I will be covering A Dark Adapted Eye by Barbara Vine, aka Ruth Rendell. Such a great book, such a great author. This was the book that Alex Michaelides recommended I read in my last interview with him here on the podcast. So I made good on that recommendation, and I am so glad I did, and I will be talking about it over on Patreon. You could always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com, and maybe you will be featured in an upcoming housekeeping/mailbag segment. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. You can find me on Facebook at Kemper Donovan Books and at KemperDonovan.com. Please take a moment to give the show a rating or a review if you haven't yet done so. They are always appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Bye.